2 days. That's how long it's been since the Browns officially named Deshaun Watson their starting quarterback. And in that span, I've watched something happen that I genuinely can't remember seeing before around this specific fan base. The backlash hasn't faded. It's gotten louder. I want to be upfront about something before I get into the details, because I think it matters for how you weigh everything that follows. Quarterback decisions in this league almost always come with some grumbling attached. That's normal. Fans want the guy they like to win the job, and when he doesn't, there's a predictable stretch of disappointment before everyone settles back into supporting whoever's actually under center. What's happening in Cleveland right now doesn't look like that familiar pattern. It looks like something that's building rather than settling. And I think it's worth taking seriously as its own story, rather than dismissing it as the usual noise that follows any quarterback announcement. Let me walk you through what's actually happening in Cleveland right now, because the scale of this reaction is worth understanding on its own terms before we even get to the football reasoning behind it. For 2 straight days, fans have shown up outside the Browns' facility in Berea, and the frustration on display hasn't been subtle. Local news out of Cleveland has been covering it directly, including footage of protest signs left at the Jim Brown statue outside the stadium, signs referencing Watson's contract, his production, and the broader disappointment fans feel about where this quarterback decision landed. I'm not going to walk through every message on every sign, because that's not really the point here. The point is the volume and the consistency of it. 2 full days of visible public frustration aimed at a decision that was supposed to settle a competition, not reignite one. Here's what makes this genuinely unusual to me. I said a few days ago that if this competition had gone the other way, and Watson got named the starter through a clean, uncontested process, that's simply how these things go sometimes. You live with it. I've been wrong about plenty of quarterback evaluations before, and I'll own that openly when it happens. But what's happening right now isn't a normal split reaction where half the fan base grumbles and moves on. Nearly every national media voice covering this story, and nearly every visible pocket of the Browns fan base has landed in the same place, squarely behind Shedeur Sanders. That kind of near-unanimous alignment across outlets that don't usually agree on much is genuinely rare, and I think it connects directly back to how Sanders got here in the first place. Anyone who followed his draft slide down to the 5th round remembers how that played out. At the time, plenty of people assumed a fall that steep would define the rest of his story in a negative way. Instead, it seems to have done the opposite. Watching him outperform that draft slot in live reps has built him a level of goodwill that a smoother, more conventional path probably wouldn't have produced. When a player visibly plays better than the situation everyone expected him to be stuck in, fans tend to notice, and they tend to remember exactly who doubted him along the way. I think there's a broader lesson buried in that specific dynamic too, one that extends beyond just this one quarterback room. Draft slides, driven by circumstances outside a player's actual evaluation, tend to create exactly this kind of built-in sympathy once that player finally gets a real opportunity. Every added minute of tape that shows the player performing well against that lowered expectation only deepens the sense that something was missed the first time around. Sanders benefits from that dynamic every single time he takes a meaningful snap, and it's part of why the reaction to Cleveland's decision has carried this much emotional weight rather than staying a purely statistical debate. Now let's actually get into the football substance behind this, because there's a real statistical and structural argument underneath all the noise, and I think it deserves more attention than the protest signs alone. The clearest edge people keep bringing up in Sanders' favor is arm talent. Multiple sources close to this camp have described his ball coming out with more velocity and better overall placement than Watson's, snap for snap, drill for drill. That's a fairly significant thing to hear about a 9-year veteran going up against a rookie. The Browns' own counterargument, at least publicly, has centered on something different entirely: cadence and pre-snap operation. The idea being that Watson's experience shows up specifically in how he manipulates a defense before the ball is even snapped, drawing free plays, disguising intentions, controlling tempo. I actually think that's a legitimate coaching point in the abstract. Pre-snap command is real, and it's something young quarterbacks often take years to fully develop. But here's the problem with using it as the deciding explanation in this specific case. Sanders has flashed that exact same trait already, drawing offside penalties off snap count manipulation multiple times this preseason, including specifically during the joint practice window against Buffalo. One assistant on this staff even highlighted it publicly, pointing out that Sanders used the snap count to steal an easy 5 yards on 2 separate occasions in that same half, slowing down the pass rush and forcing the defense to show its coverage early. If the argument for Watson is specifically the pre-snap game, and Sanders is already showing flashes of that exact skill as a rookie, the gap being described doesn't line up cleanly with what's actually shown up on tape. I want to sit with that specific tension for a moment longer, because it's really the crux of why so much skepticism has built up around the organization's explanation. Coaching staffs are allowed to value things that don't always show up cleanly in a highlight package. And pre-snap command, genuinely, is one of those harder-to-quantify skills that experienced play callers tend to trust more than raw arm talent in certain contexts. I don't think that reasoning is inherently dishonest, but when the specific evidence used to justify that reasoning, a rookie already flashing the exact trait being cited as the veteran's advantage, doesn't match the explanation being given, it's fair for outside observers to wonder whether the full picture is actually being shared, or whether other factors are driving this decision that simply aren't being said out loud. There's also the more basic accountability question worth raising here. Watson has dealt with multiple false starts across these preseason games, including one during the Chicago outing that came with the first-team offense on the field and forced Cleveland to burn a timeout just to manage the fallout. That's not a small operational hiccup. That's exactly the kind of pre-snap breakdown the cadence argument is supposedly built to prevent in the first place. Meanwhile, by most accounts, Sanders hasn't had a comparable offside or false start issue of his own through this same stretch. When the stated justification for a decision doesn't match what's actually observable on the field, it's fair for people to question whether the real reasoning is being fully explained. I want to be fair to the other side of this too, because false starts happen to plenty of experienced quarterbacks, especially in preseason settings where communication and operational rhythm are still being installed from scratch. 1 or 2 isolated incidents wouldn't be worth building an entire argument around. But when the specific justification for a decision is built on operational command, and the player receiving that justification has the more visible operational lapses on tape, that's not a minor inconsistency. That's the exact evidence that should be central to the case, working against the conclusion instead of supporting it. One comparison worth remembering here, because it adds real context to how skeptical fans have become of anything coming out of that building on this specific topic. This exact conversation happened last year too, just with a different name attached to it. There was a period where internal messaging suggested Dillon Gabriel was better equipped to run the offense at that point in time. Then the games actually started, and everyone watched how that played out on the scoreboard. In overall offensive explosiveness, in wins. I don't think we need to relitigate that entire chapter here. The point is simply that this fan base has already been burned once by a public narrative that didn't match what showed up once the football actually started, and that history is a big part of why the skepticism right now runs as deep as it does. That kind of repeated pattern does real damage to an organization's credibility over time, even beyond whatever happens with this specific decision. Once a fan base has watched a public explanation get contradicted by the results on the field, every future explanation gets filtered through that same lens of doubt. It doesn't matter if this year's reasoning happens to be completely sound. The benefit of the doubt has already been spent, and rebuilding that kind of trust usually takes a lot longer than losing it did in the first place. That's exactly the dynamic playing out in these comment sections and outside that facility right now, whether the coaching staff wants to acknowledge it publicly or not. There's real reporting from inside the building suggesting Sanders is genuinely progressing quickly on the harder, less visible parts of quarterback play. Protecting himself, reading defenses, managing protections and motions at the line. According to people with direct access to these practices, the internal reviews on his overall development have reportedly been strong. The stated reasoning for still giving Dillon Gabriel more time appears tied to wanting him to keep developing at his own pace as well, not necessarily a reflection that Sanders isn't ready. That's a nuance worth holding on to, because it complicates a simple story of the Browns just picking the wrong guy outright. This isn't purely Sanders versus Watson in every version of this conversation. Gabriel is still very much part of the bigger picture here too. I also think it's worth acknowledging the historical weight sitting underneath all of this frustration. Separate from the current quarterback decision entirely, this franchise has churned through starting quarterbacks for the better part of 2 decades, and every single time a new name gets anointed, there's an entire fan base collectively bracing for disappointment based on pure pattern recognition built up over years of similar decisions. When a fan base has been burned that many times, the reaction to any new decision tends to run hotter and more skeptical than it would somewhere with a cleaner recent history at the position. That context matters here as much as anything happening on the practice field itself. Let's shift to something separate from the quarterback drama entirely, because there's real injury news worth passing along too, and I don't want it buried under everything else happening in Cleveland right now. Undrafted receiver Michael Coates, who's had a genuinely strong camp by most accounts, was carted off the field during a session that reportedly included some pushing and shoving between players. There's real concern attached to that one, given how well he'd been playing up to this point. On a better note, a couple of names are trending back in the right direction. Carson is back in practice, and Mike Hall is back as well. Both real positives, buried inside an otherwise rough stretch of injury news for this roster heading toward final cuts. Put all of it together, and you get a Browns team navigating a genuinely unusual moment. A starting quarterback decision that's produced sustained, visible public backlash rather than the quiet acceptance these announcements usually get. A statistical and structural argument for the alternative that hasn't really been undercut by anything the organization has said publicly to justify its choice. And a fan base whose skepticism isn't coming from nowhere, but from a well-documented pattern of messaging that hasn't always lined up with what actually happened once games started counting. Whether any of this actually changes course before the regular season begins, I genuinely don't know. But 2 full days of this level of public frustration is not something this organization can simply wait out quietly, and I'll be watching closely to see whether that changes anything about how the rest of this competition actually plays out from here. What I'll actually be tracking over the next week isn't the protest signs themselves as newsworthy as they've been. It's whether Watson's operational advantage, the specific thing being cited as the reason for this decision, actually starts showing up more consistently once the games that matter get closer. If the false starts stop, if the press snap command genuinely separates itself from what Sanders is already flashing, then this entire conversation looks different in a few weeks than it does today. But if that gap continues to look thin on tape while the public explanation keeps leaning on it as the deciding factor, the frustration we're seeing outside that facility right now isn't going anywhere. It's going to keep building every single week. This organization keeps asking its fan base to trust an explanation that the film hasn't fully backed up yet.